we need to make sure that we start talking about and implementing measures that supplements our ambitions. The whole world is very long on climate ambitions, but we're very short on measures that actually are able to move us in the right direction. And those measures are things like a price on carbon that is much higher than what it is now. And on average in the world, it's not that much above zero. It's about developing and implementing technologies that make it possible for people to make a choice where they can go out of coal, as an example, and into something else that has low emissions. It's about becoming serious about financing mechanisms that also allow us to ensure that emerging economies can continue to grow and deliver on their sustainable development aspirations while moving in the right direction also in terms of energy related emissions. That has to do with things like the financing mechanism in the Paris Agreement. It has to do with the industrialized world paying the true cost of our consumption that we have to some extent moved. We moved the manufacturing of consumption goods to emerging economies without correcting the emissions. So a lot of those things have to happen quickly. And we have to start moving in the right direction now, even though we might not get there, but we have to make sure that the best doesn't become the enemy of the good. We have to do the right things as soon as possible. Well, the major impact on the scenarios from the COVID pandemic, and in particular on transportation, is that it has shifted the demand curve down. Even though it's still uncertain whether the growth rate of oil demand, transportation is about oil, basically, and it's uncertain whether the growth rate for oil demand has been significantly impacted, but the shift down in demand that we experienced in 2020 leaves sort of a permanent mark on the demand curve for all the scenarios where we shifted the levels down, even though the peak demand in each of the scenarios might happen at the same time in spite of COVID. And then a large part of the necessary change in the transport sector to deliver on climate ambitions is electrification, but that's light-duty vehicles mainly and primarily, at least in the beginning. Another part will be electrification. Another part will be energy efficiency. Continued in energy efficiency improvements, and at large, meaning that we need more efficient logistics systems. We need more demand management so that we can transport goods, for instance, in a more efficient manner than previously. Another part will be shifting of transport so that we reduce private transport and replace that with public transport, as an example. And finally, we think we will still have some fossil fuel run transportation in the future, but to the extent that we're able to introduce hydrogen into the hardest to decarbonize sectors in transport, that can become very low. So that the hydrogen shipping, hydrogen long haul trucking, etc., but that's still a long time away. But it's in that direction we will have to move in terms of the transport. Well, generally, our conclusion is that the gas demand will grow in all the scenarios for at least a decade. Part of that growth will be in the power sector, and part of it will be to some extent in transportation, but in particular in manufacturing, in the use of energy in the industry, in different industries. But then gradually, as we go towards, if we are to go towards sustainable development in terms of energy-related CO2 emissions, after a while, when gas has helped to replace coal for another decade at least, it will, in some parts of the world, in particular in the industrialized world, gas will have to go out of the power sector. and then being replaced with renewables to some extent, both new and old renewables, both hydro and the solar and wind, and to some extent also by nuclear. So gas demand in the power sector will start to fall globally in the 2030s if we are on our path to rebalance. But gas in the power sector, for instance, in Africa and in India and China, will continue to grow throughout. There will also ultimately be gradually lower gas demand when we electrify parts of the heating sector, as an example, in the building sector. So that will also be a challenge against growing gas demand globally. But there will be big regional differences in where gas demand goes, where gas demand goes, and in particular in the largest emerging economies, India and China in particular, gas demand will grow significantly from now to 2050. But it will go down in the industrialized world, like in North America, like in Europe, like in former Soviet Union, and like in India's industrial Asia Pacific, which then bodes also well and give interesting implications for continued LNG trade, because gas supply is not located in the same place as continued gas demand will be. I think it's okay to assume that we will have continued growth in solar and wind. In that sense, it's guaranteed. We will probably not have the same growth rate for very long, because growing at the same rate when something becomes much bigger is basically impossible after a while. This becomes a larger and larger part of our energy system, and it will be difficult to replace the same or to grow at the same rate, even though it, in absolute terms, can grow fast. Whether it will grow fast enough is another question, because the necessary change in the electricity system to deliver on climate ambitions is massive. There's 40% of global electricity is today run on coal, just as an example. And so it's not automatic, it's not a given that we will have sufficiently fast growth in renewables. We will need a lot of associated investments, whether it's in grids or in backup systems or in storage, that being batteries, it being could be gas-fired power plants that are turned on and off and not used very many hours during a year, but it still has to be in backup. Also, a big question going forward is once new renewables have gone up to a very large share of any given electricity system, the question on market prices becomes more acute. When renewables can't piggyback on there being a fossil fuel source of electricity that always runs. What's to guarantee a price that is above zero when everybody produces, all the wind turbines turn at the same time, all the solar panels produce electricity? The cost of that is zero at the margin. And so you don't have a guaranteed electricity price, and that's not a very good investment signal either. So we need a market design reform, which is not in place in any country in the world, to take account of how these electricity systems operate when a lot of the electricity is produced by renewable sources. So there are a lot of questions here that have to be answered. And in our rebalance scenario, for instance, those responses are there in such a manner that we, in that scenario, can believe in a very, very high growth for renewables for a long time. Well, first of all, the exercise of making scenarios and not only one single forecast illustrates that there is a very wide space of possible outcomes for future energy systems, for the future demand on any given energy source, for economic growth in any given region. So these scenarios are used to what we say wind tunnel strategies. So you test strategies, you test your investment projects. Will these projects be good, smart, profitable, sustainable, if such and such scenario happens to come into being? So if you have an investment project in Brazil, if we have in Equinor, we will test that decision to go ahead with it against different outcomes. And part of those are the scenario outcomes. translated into price sensitivities, for instance, translated into different levels of CO2 costs, CO2 prices, CO2 taxes, translated into different alternatives also in terms of relevant regulation. So that's how we use them. We use them as stories about the future, pictures of the future that will affect the profitability and the smartness and the sustainability of any kind of investment decision. And that's how we then, if we have a project that is good in all these outcomes, that's probably a very good project. It's cost efficient and so on. If we have a project that is good only in one of the three scenarios or something else, then we need to test it again. And we need to make it more robust. We need to discuss what to do about it. How do we manage the risks? How can we handle the risks, etc., etc. So that's how these exercises are used as part of a strategy discussion.